So I joined the military right out of high school, and I spent 20 years in the military. That time that I was in the military, I was in the SEAL teams. So I rose up through the ranks, started off as an enlisted guy, and then eventually got commissioned, became an officer. The last few years I was in, I ran training for the SEAL teams on the West Coast, did a couple deployments to Iraq in there as well. And then when I retired, I started teaching leadership to civilian companies, and that seemed to take on a life of its own, and ended up writing books and having a podcast, and mainly talking about leadership.
When did you realize the principles you learned in the military apply to the outside world, business world too?
The very first person that hired me to come and talk to a company was a guy that I knew, and he was the CEO of a big company, and he asked me to come up and talk to his executive team about leadership. And I think he even thought that I was going to get up there and, say, hey, you gotta be tough, and this kind of stuff. And I actually got up there and talked about cover, move, simple, prioritize and execute, decentralized command. And by the time I got done, he came up and said, I want you to talk to every division I have in my company. And as soon as people started asking me questions, that's what made me realize, all these things that I learned about leadership inside the military applies to leadership, not just in the civilian world, but just everywhere. So it was the first time that I sat down and talked to somebody about leadership outside the military is when I realized that the lessons applied across the board. And I didn't know that prior to, because I had spent my adult life in the military. I mean, I was institutionalized in the military. That's all I knew. So I had no reason to know that it worked everywhere else. But as soon as I started working with companies in the civilian sector, I realized real quick.
It is funny, there's even people within our company, they think that you're just going to come out and yell at everybody and you need to be the man. And then you start listening to what you have to say and it's the complete opposite. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, unfortunately, that's a misconception of not just military leadership, but leadership in general, that, hey, if I bark and yell, then people are going to do what I tell them to do. And look, if you're in a leadership position and you yell at your team, they're probably going to do what you tell them to do at that point in time, but it's a short-term solution, and you really haven't led them. You've just scared them, and they're going to listen to you for a short period of time. They're also going to go home and put in a job application at a bunch of other companies so they can not have to work for you because you don't treat them well. So, yeah, I think that's an unfortunate misconception, but it is a reality.
And you don't only teach the leadership principles, you're applying those leadership principles to build businesses as well yourself. So you're practicing everything you're preaching.
Yeah, no, I'm just not theoretically talking about leadership principles. I used them when I was in the military, and now I have a bunch of different businesses, and people ask me, how do you run all these different businesses? And I say, because the things that I talk about from a leadership perspective, I actually do them. And that's how I have a bunch of different businesses, and they all are pretty cool in their own aspect.
How did all those businesses happen? Did they just can you walk us through? Just, I know Echelon Front, you had a friend that asked you to come in and speak, and that one came on your doorstep. How did you get involved in the other ones?
Yeah, so I'm just kind of looking. I always try and have an open mind about what I'm looking at, and I also have an open mind, and I question my own open mind. So if there's opportunities, I'll look at opportunities and maybe apply some resources to those opportunities. And if those opportunities start to pan out, then I'll apply more resources. And if they don't, I realize that I had a dumb idea, and it's not going to work out well. And then I'll abandon that idea because it doesn't make any sense. And the only person that wanted whatever product it was I came up with was me. And sometimes that happens. But so I think having an open mind to look for opportunities, and that's all I do. I like to drink. I mean, you asked me what was the first. Well, I have a gym, right? The reason I have a gym is because I like to train jiu-jitsu, I like to train boxing, I like to train Muay Thai, I like to train wrestling, and I like to lift weights. And years ago, in order to do all those things, you had to go to a boxing gym, you had to go to a kickboxing gym, you had to go to a wrestling gym, you had to go to a jiu-jitsu gym, and you had to go to a weightlifting gym. And I wanted all those places, all those things in one spot. So I made this gym, and that was sort of the first civilian business that I made. And lo and behold, there's other people that also wanted to do multiple modalities of training in one location. So that was the first one. And then, like as you mentioned, when I retired and I saw that the leadership principles that I understood and knew could be taught to the civilian world with great impact, that was the second one. And then, well, I started my podcast because a couple guys, well, two guys, Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, who have some of the most popular podcasts ever, both told me I should start a podcast. Now, later I realized that both those guys tell everyone to start a podcast, so it was really not that big of a deal. But especially Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, if you go back 5-10 years ago, he would tell everybody to start a podcast. But he did mean it, he did mean it, but I did execute on it. And after he told me to have a podcast, I think the first podcast came out 2 weeks later. And so that was the podcast. And there was an appetite for that, and people listened to it. And so I kept making them. And then it's just, okay, what else do I like? I like jiu-jitsu. So joined forces with a company that makes jiu-jitsu gear. Right. And I like, I drink tea. So I drink this really specific type of tea. So I started making my own tea. And then I started making supplements. And then I started making, if you're going to make jiu-jitsu clothes, why not make clothing that you can wear every day, like jeans? And this is all stuff that we're making in America, because I realize and recognize the importance of the economy in America and how that drives the, I'm very supportive of the military, but one of the best ways to support, in fact, the best way to support the military is to grow businesses so that the military can exist. And so that's what I do, is I see opportunities, I apply resources. If it seems to be going well, I'll keep pouring resources into it. If it's not, then I have to say, oh, it wasn't a good idea, and I shouldn't do that anymore, and then I'll stop.
And how different are the leadership principles in all these businesses compared to your time in the military?
There is no difference.